barking! He's doing his job!
That's enough. The dog's attacking.
Store owner called police on veteran service dog. Then cops tasered, both without warning. The fluorescent lights of QuickMart flickered overhead as Marine veteran Rebecca Torres pushed through the glass doors her golden retriever service dog Atlas, padding quietly beside her in his official vest. She needed only milk and bread, a 5-minute stop that should have been routine for someone whose PTSD had finally stabilized enough to handle solo errands. But when store clerk Jimmy Patterson looked up from his phone and saw the 70-pound dog, his reaction was immediate and hostile. "Hey, lady, no dogs in here. This ain't no pet store," Patterson shouted across the small convenience store, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never read the Americans with Disabilities Act or understood the difference between a pet and medical equipment. What happened next would be captured in horrifying detail by the store's security cameras, 2 police officers tasering both a disabled veteran and her service dog, without asking a single question, creating footage that would destroy a business and careers and spark nationwide outrage about how America treats those who served in uniform. QuickMart, convenience store, Oakdale, Texas, 2025. The family-owned business sat on the corner of Main Street and Veterans Boulevard, serving a working-class community where military families made up nearly 30% of the population. Owner Hassan al-Rashid had operated the store for 12 years, building a reputation for fair prices and friendly service, but his recent delegation of daily management to his 22-year-old nephew Jimmy Patterson would prove to be a decision that destroyed everything he'd worked to build. Staff Sergeant Rebecca Torres embodied the warrior's transition from battlefield leadership to civilian survival. Her 8 years of Marine Corps service, including 2 deployments to Iraq, where she led supply convoys through some of the war's most dangerous territory. The roadside bomb that ended her military career had left her with traumatic brain injury, chronic pain, and PTSD symptoms that made routine civilian activities feel like combat missions requiring careful planning and backup systems. Atlas represented 3 years of specialized training and a $50,000 investment in therapeutic intervention that had transformed Rebecca's life from housebound isolation to functional independence. The Golden Retriever's tasks included detecting the onset of panic attacks through biochemical changes, providing mobility assistance when her TBI symptoms caused balance problems, retrieving medications during episodes, and creating protective barriers when crowded environments triggered her hypervigilance and claustrophobia. Their partnership had been forged through 18 months of intensive training that taught them to function as a single unit, with Atlas's alerts providing early warning for symptoms that Rebecca's brain injury sometimes prevented her from recognizing until they became overwhelming. The relationship wasn't emotional support, but medical necessity. The difference between independent living and the kind of institutional care that would have destroyed her dignity and drained her family's resources. Jimmy Patterson represented the dangerous combination of authority without knowledge that plagued many civilian interactions with service animals. His understanding of business law was limited to basic customer service training, while his exposure to disability accommodation consisted of occasional wheelchair ramps and large print signs that made accommodation seem simple rather than comprehensive. His assumption that all animals were pets reflected broader societal ignorance about service dog partnerships and federal disability law. Officers Mark Stevens and Brian Kelly embodied the institutional training gaps that left law enforcement unprepared to distinguish between legitimate service animals and fraudulent pets. Their police academy education emphasizing threat assessment over disability accommodation. Stevens, a 15-year veteran, had learned to prioritize quick resolution of complaints over careful investigation of circumstances, while Kelly's 3 years on the force had taught him to support his partner's decisions rather than question their legal or tactical soundness. The broader context was a post-pandemic retail environment where businesses had become increasingly suspicious of customers who challenged their policies, while law enforcement had been trained to view civilian resistance as potential threat rather than constitutional exercise. The intersection of business authority, police power, and disability discrimination created perfect conditions for civil rights violations that would have been prevented by proper training and legal knowledge. QuickMart's location in a military community should have made it more aware of veteran needs and service animal accommodation, but the business's actual policies had never been updated to reflect federal requirements or local demographics. The store's security camera system, installed primarily for theft prevention, would become crucial evidence in documenting how quickly routine accommodation requests could escalate into federal civil rights violations when handled by people who prioritized authority over understanding. The collision between Rebecca's accommodation needs and institutional ignorance was building toward a confrontation that would test whether federal disability law meant anything when it conflicted with business policies enforced by employees who had never learned the difference between legitimate authority and illegal discrimination. The crisis began the moment Rebecca entered QuickMart with Atlas at her side, his official service dog vest clearly visible, and his calm professional demeanor immediately distinguishable from pet behavior to anyone familiar with working animals. Her mission was simple: purchase milk and bread as part of her ongoing therapy to rebuild confidence in routine civilian activities that her combat-related PTSD had made challenging for 3 years following her medical discharge. "Ma'am, can't bring that dog in here," Jimmy Patterson announced from behind the counter, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd never been taught the difference between store policy and federal law. Health department regulations prohibit animals in food establishments. You'll need to leave it outside. Rebecca's response was patient and professional, drawing on military training that emphasized clear communication and proper procedures when dealing with civilian authority. "This is Atlas, my service dog. He's trained to assist with my combat-related disabilities, and federal law guarantees his access to public accommodations, including retail establishments." The documentation she offered was comprehensive and legally unassailable. Atlas's certification from a VA-approved training program, her own disability determination letter, and laminated cards explaining federal service animal law in terms that any business employee should understand. The paperwork exceeded legal requirements while proving the medical necessity that made their separation potentially dangerous for her psychological stability. But Patterson's reaction revealed both his ignorance of federal law and his commitment to what he believed were non-negotiable store policies. "I don't care what papers you got, lady. No animals means no animals. My uncle store his rules. Either the dog goes outside or you both leave." The confrontation escalated when Rebecca attempted to explain that service animals weren't pets, but medical equipment protected by federal civil rights law. "Jimmy, your name tag says Jimmy, the Americans with Disabilities Act requires businesses to accommodate service animals. Denying access is a federal crime that could cost your uncle his business license." Her explanation should have resolved the situation, but Patterson's response was to call 911 with a complaint that would set in motion the chain of events that destroyed multiple lives. "I need police at QuickMart on Main Street. Got a woman with a large dog refusing to leave when I told her animals aren't allowed. She's getting aggressive and threatening my business." The dispatch to Officers Stevens and Kelly was coded as a business disturbance with aggressive customer and animal language that primed them for confrontation rather than accommodation inquiry. Their arrival at QuickMart was tactical rather than investigative, with both officers entering the store prepared for resistance rather than civil rights education. "Ma'am, we need you to remove that animal from the premises immediately," Officer Stevens commanded without introduction or inquiry about the nature of Atlas's presence, his tone suggesting that he'd already decided the situation required enforcement rather than understanding. The business owner has the right to control who enters his establishment. Rebecca's military bearing asserted itself as she attempted to educate the officers about federal disability law, while maintaining the respectful demeanor that her Marine Corps training had taught her to use with civilian authority. "Officers, Atlas is my service dog trained to manage my combat-related PTSD. Federal law requires his accommodation in public spaces. I have documentation proving his legitimacy and my need for his assistance." The legal education that followed should have been routine service members transitioning to civilian life, often needed to educate local authorities about accommodation requirements that small-town police departments rarely encountered. Rebecca's approach was methodical and respectful, her documentation comprehensive, and her explanation clear about both her rights and the officer's obligations under federal law. But Officer Stevens's response revealed training gaps that would prove catastrophic. "Ma'am, business owners have rights too, and if they say no animals, that means no animals. Federal law doesn't override private property rights. You need to comply with our instructions or face arrest for trespassing." The legal ignorance was staggering and dangerous, with two armed officers asserting authority they didn't possess, while threatening to arrest someone for exercising federally protected civil rights. The stage was set for escalation that would transform routine accommodation into violent confrontation, captured by security cameras that would make the incident national news. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Officer Stevens moved to physically remove Atlas from the store, his approach revealing complete ignorance of both service dog law and the dangerous consequences of separating disabled veterans from their essential medical equipment. His grab for Atlas's leash was both legally wrong and tactically disastrous, triggering protective responses that had been trained into both the service dog and his handler through years of partnership and military conditioning. "Don't touch my dog," Rebecca commanded with the authority of someone whose combat leadership had once been responsible for Marine lives under fire, her voice carrying urgency that reflected both legal knowledge and medical necessity. "Separating us is illegal and dangerous. He monitors my neurological symptoms and prevents psychiatric emergencies." But Officer Stevens interpreted Rebecca's assertion of her federal rights as resistance to police authority. His training emphasizing compliance over constitutional accuracy. Ma'am, you're interfering with a lawful order. Step away from the animal or face additional charges for obstruction. His threat to arrest someone for protecting their medical equipment revealed training gaps that transformed civil rights protection into criminal activity. Atlas's response was textbook service dog behavior, positioning himself between Rebecca and the perceived threat, while maintaining the alert posture that indicated he was monitoring her stress levels for signs of impending PTSD episode. His training had taught him to protect his handler from situations that could trigger psychological crisis. But his protective stance was interpreted by Officer Kelly as aggressive behavior requiring immediate neutralization. "Stevens, that dog's getting ready to attack," Kelly announced as he drew his taser, his threat assessment based on ignorance about service dog behavior rather than actual aggression indicators. "I'm not waiting for it to bite someone." His decision to treat medical intervention as hostile action would create the most documented police brutality case in Texas history. The escalation accelerated when Rebecca, recognizing the imminent danger to Atlas, moved to shield him from the officers who clearly intended violence against her service animal. Her protective instincts honed through combat deployments, where she'd risked her life to save wounded Marines, overrode civilian caution as she positioned herself between the officers and the dog whose partnership had saved her from suicide during her darkest post-combat period. "He's not attacking. He's doing his job," Rebecca shouted as she knelt beside Atlas, her hands moving to calm the service dog, whose stress indicators were showing that her own psychological state was deteriorating toward crisis levels. "Look at his posture, his breathing. He's providing medical assistance, not showing aggression." The explanation was accurate and medically crucial, but Officer Stevens interpreted Rebecca's protective positioning as preparation for resistance that justified immediate use of force. "Ma'am, get away from that animal. Now you're creating a dangerous situation that requires tactical response." His ultimatum revealed complete failure to understand that he was demanding separation that could trigger the exact medical emergency that Atlas was trained to prevent. The moment of crisis came when Atlas detected the biochemical changes that preceded Rebecca's panic attacks, his training activating as he began the deep pressure therapy that was designed to interrupt her symptoms before they became overwhelming. His movement toward Rebecca was professional medical intervention, but to the officers, it appeared to confirm their assumption that the dog was attacking his handler. "That's it, the dog's attacking," Kelly shouted as he fired his taser, 50,000 volts coursing through Atlas's body and dropping him to the convenience store floor in convulsions. The service dog's agonized yelps echoed through the small store while Rebecca screamed in horror at witnessing her lifeline being tortured by people who claimed to serve and protect. But the violence didn't stop with Atlas's assault when Rebecca instinctively moved to help her electrocuted service dog. Officer Stevens interpreted her movement as aggressive resistance requiring additional force. His taser deployment sent 50,000 volts through Rebecca's body as well, the electrical current disrupting her already damaged nervous system, while triggering the kind of traumatic stress response that Atlas had been trained to prevent and manage. The convenience store's security cameras captured every moment in high definition a disabled veteran and her service dog being electrocuted for the crime of seeking accommodation that federal law guaranteed while store employee Jimmy Patterson watched from behind the counter in growing horror as he realized his 911 call had created a civil rights atrocity that would destroy everything his uncle had built. The dual taser deployment left both Rebecca and Atlas convulsing on the floor while Officers Stevens and Kelly stood over them with weapons drawn, their tactical victory complete despite the growing understanding that they had just committed federal crimes against a disabled veteran and her medical equipment. The security footage would become evidence in criminal prosecutions that would end careers while costing taxpayers millions in civil rights settlements. The immediate aftermath was chaos, as other customers who had witnessed the assault began shouting at the officers, their outrage creating exactly the kind of hostile crowd situation that proper de-escalation training was designed to prevent. The incident that had begun with simple accommodation request had escalated into mass casualty event that would require paramedic response for both human and animal victims of police brutality. The broader implications were becoming clear as word spread through Oakdale's veteran community that a Marine combat veteran had been assaulted for exercising her federal disability rights. While the QuickMart business that had initiated the complaint faced the kind of community backlash that could destroy family enterprises built over decades of honest service. The horror deepened as paramedics worked frantically to stabilize both Rebecca and Atlas, their medical interventions, revealing the devastating extent of neurological damage that dual taser deployment had inflicted on a combat veteran whose brain injury had left her particularly vulnerable to electrical trauma. Rebecca's condition was critical. Her traumatic brain injury, exacerbated by electrical shock that had disrupted neural pathways, still recovering from wartime damage, while Atlas lay motionless, except for occasional convulsions that suggested permanent neurological impairment. We need immediate transport to Regional Medical Center for the human victim and emergency veterinary intervention for the service animal. EMT Supervisor Linda Rodriguez announced as she supervised treatment that should never have been necessary. Both victims show signs of severe electrical trauma complicated by pre-existing medical conditions that make recovery uncertain. The medical assessment was devastating but legally crucial, providing expert documentation that transformed the officer's assault from simple, excessive force to aggravated battery against a disabled veteran whose vulnerability had been obvious to anyone with basic training in disability accommodation. The neurological damage was measurable and potentially permanent, creating grounds for federal prosecution and civil penalties that could bankrupt the city of Oakdale. Officer Stevens's attempts to justify the dual assault revealed the depth of his ignorance and the desperation of someone who understood that his career was ending. Both the suspect and the animal were displaying aggressive behavior that threatened public safety. We used appropriate force to neutralize multiple threats in a confined space with civilian bystanders present. But the security camera footage contradicted every aspect of his narrative, showing Rebecca exercising her federal rights, while Atlas performed trained medical functions, neither displaying any behavior that could justify electrical assault by law enforcement officers. The visual evidence was overwhelming and legally devastating, creating the kind of undeniable documentation that made police accountability inevitable rather than negotiable. The community's reaction was immediate and explosive as news of the assault spread through Oakdale's military families, with veterans who had served alongside Rebecca in Iraq arriving at the hospital to demand answers about how a decorated Marine combat veteran could be tortured for seeking accommodation that federal law guaranteed. Their anger was righteous and dangerous, creating exactly the kind of volatile situation that proper police training was designed to prevent. The darkest revelation came when QuickMart security footage went viral within hours, shared by witnesses who understood they had documented something unprecedented: the systematic torture of a disabled veteran and her service animal by police officers whose ignorance about federal law had created the most clear-cut civil rights violation in recent memory. The video's spread was unstoppable, with millions of views creating national outrage that would force federal intervention. Hassan al-Rashid's arrival at his store to find it surrounded by protesters marked the beginning of his family business's destruction, as customers and community members who had supported QuickMart for 12 years now viewed it as the source of an assault that had traumatized one of their own veterans. His nephew's 911 call had not only destroyed Rebecca and Atlas, but had unleashed consequences that would obliterate everything Hassan had worked to build. "Uncle, I just thought the health department. I didn't know." Jimmy Patterson's attempts to explain his ignorance provided no comfort to Hassan, whose understanding of American disability law had always exceeded his nephew's, but who had trusted daily operations to someone whose prejudice and ignorance had created catastrophic liability for their family business. The federal investigation began within 24 hours, as Department of Justice Civil Rights Division attorneys recognized that the security footage documented violations so clear and egregious that criminal prosecution was inevitable. The assault on a disabled veteran exercising federally protected rights created exactly the kind of case that federal prosecutors use to establish precedent and send messages about constitutional accountability. The medical prognosis was uncertain and terrifying for both victims, with Rebecca's traumatic brain injury complications requiring intensive care, while Atlas's neurological damage might prevent him from ever again performing the service dog tasks that had kept his handler functional and independent. The partnership that had taken 3 years to develop could be permanently destroyed by 30 seconds of police ignorance and violence. The psychological impact extended throughout Oakdale's veteran community, as service members who had thought civilian life was safe were forced to confront evidence that their disabilities made them targets rather than beneficiaries of institutional protection. The trust that had enabled their reintegration was shattered by footage showing that federal rights meant nothing when confronted by local ignorance and authorized violence. The darkest moment was the growing understanding that Rebecca and Atlas might never recover the independence and partnership that had made their civilian life possible, while the officers who had destroyed their lives faced consequences that would be measured in months of suspension rather than years of incarceration that their crimes deserved. The transformation began when General Patricia Hayes, commanding general of the U.S. Army Medical Command and Rebecca's former superior officer, arrived in Oakdale with a team of military legal advocates whose presence immediately elevated the incident from local police misconduct to federal civil rights case requiring comprehensive institutional response. Her intervention wasn't coincidental. Veteran networks had alerted military leadership about the assault on one of their own, triggering protective responses that civilian authorities couldn't ignore or minimize. This is not just an assault on Staff Sergeant Torres. It's an attack on every service member who has sacrificed for this nation. General Hayes announced during a press conference held outside Regional Medical Center where Rebecca remained in intensive care. The officers who tortured a decorated Marine veteran for exercising her federal disability rights will face the full consequences of military and civilian justice systems. The military's involvement transformed the legal dynamics completely, with Department of Defense attorneys working alongside Department of Justice prosecutors to ensure that federal civil rights charges reflected both the severity of the crimes and their impact on veteran community confidence in civilian institutions. The case became a test of whether America honored its commitments to those who had served in uniform. The breakthrough came when Dr. Sarah Kim, a leading expert in traumatic brain injury and electrical trauma, provided medical testimony that documented the permanent neurological damage both victims had suffered. Her examination revealed that Rebecca's TBI had been significantly worsened by electrical shock, while Atlas's service dog capabilities had been compromised by neurological impairment that might never fully heal. The Tasered deployment against Staff Sergeant Torres was not just excessive force, it was torture of someone whose brain injury made her uniquely vulnerable to electrical trauma. Dr. Kim testified during federal court proceedings. The damage to her neural pathways has set back her recovery by years and may prevent her from ever again living independently without intensive medical support. The community's response was overwhelming and sustained, with Oakdale residents organizing support that included boycotts of QuickMart fundraising for Rebecca's medical expenses and protests demanding accountability from police leadership that had failed to train officers in basic constitutional law. The military families, who made up 30% of the population, led efforts that transformed local politics and forced institutional changes. But the most meaningful intervention came from an unexpected source: Hassan al-Rashid's decision to take full responsibility for his business's role in triggering the assault. His public apology was comprehensive and sincere, acknowledging that his failure to properly train his nephew about disability accommodation had created the conditions for civil rights violations that had traumatized a veteran customer. My family came to America seeking opportunity and freedom, values that Staff Sergeant Torres defended through her military service. Hassan announced during a community meeting held at the local VFW post. My nephew's ignorance and my failure to train him properly contributed to an assault that violated everything our country stands for. I take full responsibility and commit to making this right. Hassan's response included closing QuickMart permanently and donating the business's entire value, over $300,000, to Rebecca's medical fund and veteran service organizations working on disability accommodation education. His sacrifice was both personally devastating and morally necessary, demonstrating accountability that government officials had failed to show. The federal prosecution was swift and comprehensive, with Officers Stevens and Kelly facing federal civil rights charges carrying up to 10 years in prison for willfully violating the constitutional rights of a disabled veteran. The charges were enhanced by hate crime statutes that recognized attacks on disabled individuals as bias crimes, requiring enhanced penalties. The legal precedent established through the case created new standards for police interaction with service animals and disabled veterans, with federal courts ruling that law enforcement officers who failed to recognize service animal partnerships could face personal liability for civil rights violations. The precedent influenced police training nationwide while providing legal protection for disabled veterans who had been vulnerable to similar attacks. Rebecca's recovery was gradual and incomplete, with months of intensive rehabilitation partially restoring cognitive functions while leaving her dependent on medical support that Atlas could no longer provide due to his own neurological impairment. The partnership that had made independent living possible was permanently altered, requiring new therapeutic interventions and support systems. But her transformation from victim to advocate became the most powerful legacy of the assault, with Rebecca's testimony before Congress leading to passage of the Veteran Service Animal Protection Act, which created federal criminal penalties for assaulting service animals while mandating specialized training for all law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding. What happened to Atlas and me wasn't just about two victims, Rebecca told the House Veterans Affairs Committee during nationally televised hearings. It was about whether America keeps its promises to veterans who sacrificed for freedoms that we were tortured for trying to exercise. Our assault proves that disability rights mean nothing without enforcement and education. The educational impact extended throughout law enforcement as police academies incorporated the Oakdale incident into their curricula about constitutional law and disability accommodation. The case became a textbook example of how ignorance and prejudice could create federal liability while violating the basic rights of citizens who had earned protection through military service. Atlas's partial recovery became a symbol of resilience and adaptation, with his remaining capabilities redirected toward emotional support and public education, rather than the complex medical tasks that his neurological damage had made impossible. His transformation from service dog to advocacy ambassador demonstrated both the consequences of institutional violence and the possibility of finding new purpose after trauma. The institutional changes were comprehensive and lasting, with the Oakdale Police Department operating under federal consent decree that required ongoing monitoring and accountability. The department's complete reform included leadership changes, policy revisions, and training programs that made it a model for veteran accommodation and disability rights protection. The community healing was facilitated through initiatives that brought together law enforcement veterans and disability advocates in collaborative efforts to prevent similar incidents while supporting those who had been traumatized by institutional failures. The town that had been divided by the assault became united in commitment to protecting rather than persecuting its most vulnerable residents. The annual Rebecca Torres Veterans Rights Day became a national observance that honored service animal partnerships while educating communities about disability accommodation and constitutional obligations. The event attracted visitors from throughout the country while generating economic activity that demonstrated how moral leadership could create positive change. 5 years later, Rebecca's advocacy work had influenced federal policy, state legislation, and local training programs that protected thousands of disabled veterans from similar assaults. Her transformation from victim to voice proved that individual courage could inspire institutional change when supported by communities willing to confront their failures and commit to improvement. The final scene was both personal triumph and systemic validation. Rebecca stood with Atlas, now retired but healthy, at the dedication of the Oakdale Veterans Disability Rights Center, a facility funded by the federal settlement and community donations that provided legal assistance, advocacy, training, and support services for disabled veterans throughout the region. Atlas and I didn't choose to become symbols. Rebecca reflected during the dedication ceremony, attended by hundreds of supporters who had followed their journey from assault to advocacy. But we chose to transform our trauma into action that protects others from experiencing what we survived. Sometimes, the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, they're achieved when communities decide that protecting the vulnerable is more important than protecting the institutions that failed them. The Rebecca Torres and Atlas incident became a transformational moment for federal disability rights enforcement and law enforcement accountability, establishing legal precedents and training requirements that protected thousands of disabled veterans while fundamentally changing how police approached service animal encounters and disability accommodation throughout the United States. The immediate consequences revolutionized police training nationwide, with the Department of Justice mandating disability rights education for all federally funded law enforcement agencies within 18 months. The comprehensive program reached over 900,000 officers, while preventing countless future incidents through enhanced understanding of constitutional obligations and service animal partnerships. The Veteran Service Animal Protection Act created the first federal criminal penalties specifically targeting assaults on service animals, with sentences up to 10 years in prison and $500,000 fines for law enforcement officers who violated service animal rights. The legislation influenced state laws throughout the country while establishing legal framework for prosecuting similar cases that previously had been treated as mere property damage. The federal court precedents established through Rebecca's civil rights lawsuit strengthened enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act, while creating new liability standards for police departments that failed to train officers in disability accommodation. The precedents influenced thousands of subsequent cases while providing legal protection for disabled veterans who had been vulnerable to institutional discrimination and violence. The law enforcement training revolution extended beyond service animal education to encompass comprehensive disability rights instruction that addressed the full spectrum of accommodations that disabled citizens might require during police encounters. The training influenced academy curricula while establishing professional standards that recognized disability accommodation as core constitutional responsibility. The business community transformation was equally significant, with retailers throughout Texas and beyond implementing disability accommodation training that prevented similar incidents while creating inclusive environments for disabled customers. The QuickMart closure became a cautionary tale about the consequences of ignorance, while inspiring proactive education that protected both businesses and disabled consumers. The advocacy movement that emerged from Rebecca's case created new organizations focused specifically on veteran disability rights and police accountability. The Rebecca Torres Foundation became a leading voice for service animal protection while providing legal assistance, training resources, and policy advocacy that influenced legislation in all 50 states. The medical research that documented Rebecca's recovery and Atlas's rehabilitation influenced academic understanding of traumatic brain injury, electrical trauma, and service animal partnerships. The findings contributed to treatment protocols while validating the essential nature of service animal relationships for disabled veterans' independence and psychological stability. The cultural impact transformed public understanding of veteran disabilities and the consequences of institutional ignorance about constitutional rights. Rebecca's story educated millions about PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and service animal training, while demonstrating that disabled veterans deserve protection rather than persecution from the institutions they had served. The international influence extended to allied nations whose law enforcement agencies adopted similar service animal protection protocols based on lessons learned from the American experience. The model influenced police training in Canada, Australia, and NATO countries while establishing international standards for disability accommodation in law enforcement. The enduring message transcended individual triumph to encompass fundamental truths. Service animals were medical equipment deserving legal protection. Disabled veterans earned accommodation through their sacrifice. And the strongest communities were those that held institutions accountable for protecting rather than persecuting their most vulnerable citizens.